I was never supposed to hold a savior.
I was made for shade, for shelter, for the nests of sparrows and the laughter of children sitting beneath my arms on warm summer days. That was my life. That was my purpose. Or so I believed. But sometimes the thing you were made to do is nothing like the thing you were chosen for. And in the end, it was not the years I stood in the sunlight that mattered. It was one single afternoon, one man, one moment that changed everything. But to understand what happened on that hill, you first have to understand who I was before the axes came. I was born in a forest that stretched as far as any eye could see. A forest so thick and green that even at midday the sunlight came through my leaves like gold through a sieve. I was not the tallest tree, not the oldest, but I was strong. My roots reached deep into the earth, drinking from springs that had been flowing since before men walked this land. I grew through 100 winters, through droughts and floods and storms that bent my branches back until I thought they would snap. But I never fell. Seasons passed in rhythms I came to know as well as my own grain. Spring brought new birds who built their nests in my higher branches and sang at sunrise. Summer brought children who climbed on my limbs and pressed their backs against my bark and looked up through my leaves at a sky that seemed to have no edges. Autumn turned my leaves to fire, red and gold and deep amber, falling one by one like small, gentle goodbyes. Winter left me bare and silver under cold stars. And then, spring again. I watched generations of the same family walk beneath me. I watched a young boy become an old man. I watched lovers carve their names into my skin with small knives. And years later, I watched those same lovers bring their own children to sit where they once sat. There is a kind of love that only a very old tree knows. The love of watching life unfold slowly, year by year, like a story being told in no hurry. I believed my purpose was clear. I was a living thing, and my life gave life to others. That was enough. That was everything. But then I began to notice things in the distance, sounds that did not belong to the forest. The rhythmic clink of iron, the murmur of soldiers marching on roads they had cut through my brothers and sisters to the west, smoke in the sky where forest used to be. And one morning, not long after the birds had returned for spring, I heard the axes. Not one, many, coming closer. They arrived at the edge of my forest while the dew was still on the grass. A group of Roman soldiers, their armor catching the early light. They did not look at me the way the children had. They did not see life when they looked at me. They saw lumber. They saw usefulness, and one of them pointed directly at me. The first axe hit like a thunderclap. If you have never felt an axe strike into the heart of you, I cannot fully explain what it is. It is not pain exactly the way a human feels pain. It is deeper than that. It is the sound of your own life cracking. The first blow took a piece of my bark and exposed the white wood beneath. And something in me that had stood firm for 100 years began to understand that it was over. The second blow. The third. They worked in turns, 2 soldiers with their axes swinging in rhythm like they had done this 100 times. Because they had. I tried to hold on. My roots pulled at the earth. But roots are only as strong as the ground that holds them, and the ground cannot hold against iron. Then I fell. The sound of a great tree falling is something the whole forest hears. It is a crack and a rush and a crash that moves the very air. And then, silence. A silence heavier than anything I had known in all my years of standing. My branches that had held birds and children and summer light were suddenly pressed into the dirt. My roots, which had reached so deep and held so faithfully, were torn free and pointed at the sky like confused hands. They stripped me as they worked. Branches gone, bark peeled back. What had been a living tree full of curves and beauty and irregularity was forced into something straight and rigid and blunt. They dragged me behind horses on a road that cut through the forest I had lived in my whole life. I passed beneath the shadows of trees I had known for generations, and I was no longer one of them. I was something else now. I did not yet know what. But something in the way those soldiers moved, something in the routine efficiency of their hands, told me this was not the first time they had done this. And whatever I was becoming, it was not meant to give life. They brought me to a city. Rome had been building its empire with wood and iron and the silence of the people it conquered. I was hauled into a workshop where other pieces of wood lay waiting, and rough men with chisels and mallets shaped me into the form I would carry forever. Two beams, a long one and a shorter one, joined together at the top. When they were finished, they stood back and looked at their work, and not one of them felt anything at all. I knew what I was now. Even before I saw it for the first time, I knew, because I had heard the cries before, echoing across hills and roads as Roman soldiers carried out the empire's final judgment on those it had condemned. I had heard that sound from a distance, deep in my forest, and I had not understood it. Now I was going to be the thing that produced it. The first time they used me, it was a man whose name I never learned. He was brought out early in the morning with two others, all of them bloodied, all of them stumbling. The crowd that gathered was not grieving. They were watching the way people watch something they cannot look away from and cannot stand to see at the same time. I felt the weight of that first man as he was raised up on me. And I wish I could tell you that something miraculous happened then. But nothing did. He cried out. He suffered. He died. And then I was taken down and stored and brought out again when the next one came. This went on for a long time, longer than I want to say. I was a tool of the empire, a weapon, a warning to anyone who thought about standing against the power of Rome. And somewhere in those long, terrible months, I began to wonder if this was all I would ever be. If this was the true shape of my life after the forest. Not shelter and song and summer shade, but this. Weight, suffering, ending. But there was something, a feeling so faint I nearly missed it every time it came. Like a single note played at the edge of hearing. A sense that not every day would be like this, that something was coming, something different. I could not explain it, I could not name it, but it was there, quiet and persistent, like the first green shoot after a long winter. Something was coming, and it would change everything. I knew it was different the moment the morning began. Jerusalem was never quiet during Passover. The city filled up with pilgrims from every direction, and the streets were thick with noise and the smell of fires and roasting lamb. But this morning had a different energy beneath the noise. A current of something I had never felt before. Not just excitement or fear, though both of those were present in the crowd that gathered outside the governor's hall. It was something older than either. Something that felt, in a way I cannot explain, like the turning of a great wheel that had been turning for a very long time. The crowd that had gathered was strange. Most crowds before an execution were quiet, in a grim kind of way, or loud, in a cruel kind of way. This crowd was both at once, and something more. There were people weeping openly. There were people shouting with what looked like triumph. There were children who had been brought there by their fathers and did not understand what they were seeing. There were soldiers who looked bored, because this was their ordinary work. And then they brought him out. I had held many men. I knew the weight of a condemned man, the way his body moved when he had been beaten and could barely stand, the way he gripped the wood or did not grip it at all, depending on how much he had already given up. I thought I knew what to expect. I was wrong. He had been beaten badly. Anyone could see that. His back was open and raw from the whipping, and his face was swollen, and there was blood dried in his beard and fresh blood from the crown of thorns they had pressed down onto his head, a thing that was meant to mock him, to make people laugh at the idea of a king in thorns.
But no one who looked at him closely seemed to be laughing. There was a sign above him that read, "King of the Jews."
They meant it as an insult. I was not sure it landed that way. He fell on the road. The crowd surged. A man was pulled from the crowd to help carry me beside him. A man from Cyrene who looked bewildered and afraid, but did what he was told. Through all of it, through the falling and the noise and the soldiers shouting and the women crying at the edge of the road, he was quieter than any man I had ever seen walking this path. Not silent with despair, silent with something else. When they reached the hill, I felt the moment arriving, like a held breath before a storm.
I have thought many times about how to tell this part.
I have turned it over in whatever way a piece of wood turns things over. And I have decided that the only way to tell it is carefully, because what happened on that hill was not simply the death of a man, though it was that. It was also something that had no name yet, something that the whole creation seemed to hold its breath to witness. They laid him against me on the ground, his back against my grain, his arms stretched out along my crossbeam. His breath was shallow and ragged from everything they had already done to him. The soldiers moved with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this many times, and they drove the nails through his wrists and through his feet, and they raised me up until I was standing upright on that hill with him hanging against me. The weight of him was not like any weight I had held before. I say this knowing that sounds strange. Wood feels weight the way wood feels it. But this weight had something in it that I cannot fully account for. Something that made the grain of me shift and settle, as if I were trying to hold something the size of the whole world in a space no bigger than two crossed beams of timber. The sky began to change. It had been morning, clear and hard and bright with the Passover sun. But within an hour, clouds began to gather from nowhere, from every direction, as if the sky itself were responding to what was happening on that hill.
By midday, it was dark.
Not the gentle dark of an overcast afternoon. Dark in the middle of the day. Dark like the world had simply decided to stop and look away from itself. People in the crowd said things. Some mocked, some wept. Some stood very still with the look of people who do not understand what they are witnessing, but know, somewhere deeper than thought, that they are witnessing something. The soldiers divided the clothes he had come in. An ordinary moment inside an extraordinary one. He spoke. A few times. Words I will carry forever, in whatever way a piece of wood carries things. He spoke to the man hanging beside him, a criminal. A man who in his last moments turned to this bleeding, broken person and said, "Remember me." And the answer came back, "Today you will be with me in paradise." I felt the criminal's body shift when he heard that. Something let go in him. I felt it. He spoke to a woman below him and to the man standing beside her, giving them to each other in the way that someone gives their most precious things away when they know they are leaving. He called out once in a voice that split the dark air, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And the question did not sound like despair, though it had the shape of despair. It sounded like something older, like a man walking into the deepest part of a dark room because he has been sent there and will not flinch from it. And then he said 3 words that I believe will outlast everything that has ever been built or spoken or dreamed in all of human history. It is finished. The earth shook. Not a small tremor, a shaking that moved through the ground like something enormous exhaling after holding its breath for a very long time. The soldiers stumbled. The crowd cried out. Stones cracked somewhere in the city. And one of the soldiers, the one closest to me, looked up at what he had done and said, quietly, to no one in particular, "Truly, this was the Son of God." And then there was silence. A silence unlike any silence I had known in the forest or anywhere after. Not the silence of ending. Something else. Something more like the silence before a word is spoken. before a story begins. They took him down before sunset. His friends, or the few of them brave enough to be there, took his body and carried him to a tomb nearby, a new tomb cut into the rock, and the stone was rolled closed. The soldiers who had stayed to ensure it was done properly walked back toward the city, talking about their evening meal. The crowd was gone. The hill was empty. I was left there. I stood through that night, and the next day, and the day after, in a way that felt different from all my years in the forest. Then, I had been rooted, part of the living world. Now I was planted in rock, on a hill where the ground was dark with things that had been spilled on it over many years. And I was not living, and I was not part of anything I could name. I was simply there, waiting, though I did not know for what. The city around me was confused. I could feel it in the way sound travels through a place after something enormous has happened. People speaking in low voices, people asking questions. The disciples of the man who had died were hidden somewhere, doors bolted, trying to understand how everything they had believed had led to this. The religious leaders were satisfied and nervous at the same time, the way people are when they have gotten what they wanted, but are not sure it was enough. Pilate was already trying to forget that any of it had happened. The second night fell. Then the third morning began. And then something moved through the air that I felt before I heard it. Before anyone said anything, before the first woman arrived at the tomb and found the stone rolled away and everything inside it empty, I felt something change, like the moment before dawn, when the darkness is exactly as deep as it gets right before the light begins. Like the first note of a song you have heard before but could not remember until this moment. Something had happened in that tomb. Something that had never happened before in all the time the world had been turning. The news spread the way fire spreads in dry grass. First in whispers, then in voices too loud to contain. Then, in something approaching the sound of a city that has lost its mind with joy. He is not there. The tomb is empty. He appeared to the women. He appeared to the disciples behind locked doors. He appeared on a road outside the city to two men who walked with him for hours and did not know who he was until he broke bread at their table. And then he was gone again. And I began to understand something, not all at once. The way true understanding always comes, slowly, like light filling a room through a narrow window, until the whole room is bright and you can see everything that was always there, waiting to be seen. I had spent my life in the forest, believing my purpose was to give life through shade and shelter and the slow, patient offering of myself to the seasons. And then I had been cut down and made into something I could not have chosen, something that for a long time felt like the destruction of everything I had been. I had held suffering. I had been present at endings, and I had believed, in the dark hours on that hill, that I had been made into a symbol of everything that is wrong with the world. Power, cruelty, the ability of empire to crush anything it fears. But I was wrong. I was not a symbol of what power does to the powerless. I had become something the world had never seen before. I was the place where death was defeated. Not avoided, not escaped, defeated from the inside by someone who walked into the deepest darkness willingly and came back carrying the light. Every person who had ever been afraid, every person who had ever suffered something they could not make sense of, every person who had ever stood at the edge of an ending and could not see anything on the other side. I was not a reminder of their despair. I was the place where their story turned, the hinge of all of history, the moment when everything that had been heading toward darkness began heading somewhere else. He had chosen me. Out of every piece of wood, in every forest in the whole world, they had come to my forest. They had cut me down. They had shaped me into this, and I had been carried up that hill. And on the third day, when everything the world thought it knew about death was turned inside out, I was still standing there.